Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review. And Happy New Year to all of you joining back after a little break here. We're waiting for James Harding, who is in Kenya, probably having some problems getting online, but we hope to have him here soon. In the meantime, we have Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker, with us from Washington, D.C. Susan, Happy New Year. Great to see you.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having us, convening us.
Well, we're going to do it every week for the rest of the year. Stefan Kornelius from Munich is joining us. He is the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, great to see you, and Happy New Year to you as well.
Happy New Year from Germany.
So lots of things to talk about. And Susan, let me start with you. Of course, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. It was a really momentous day, a lot of things happening in Washington, but talk a little bit about the larger meaning for the United States and for the world in terms of the state of democracy. What does not only January 6th mean, but a year later, what does the anniversary sort of underscore about where we are when it comes to the stability of our country and democracy as a force in world affairs?
Well, thank you, Ivo. I wish I had a better sort of news to report here from Washington. But what I would say is that, the observation, I think, has been proven correct time and again, which is that not only is the U.S. sort of divided increasingly against itself, but the trend is toward more rather than less of that. And this kind of two-toned view of January 6th and what it meant and signaled for the state of American democracy, I think, is as valid a way of looking at that crisis inside the country as anything. And yesterday it was a tale of, on the one hand, this very cutting and incisive and sort of devastating speech by President Biden. I think it was a speech that a lot of his supporters were desperate for him to give. Surprised that he hadn't taken on Trump and January 6th denialism and election denialism much sooner, frankly, in terms like he did yesterday. But, he was unsparing. He was strong, passionate, even about what he called the dagger pointed at the heart of American democracy. This is not the normal language of American presidents. You have to, in fact, go very far back in time, really, to the period leading up to and just after the American Civil War in the mid-19th century to find rhetoric like this from an American president. Often our campaigns, our political campaigns, have featured sharp and even divisive rhetoric, but it's very, very unusual in the annals of the American presidency to see someone from who's a current occupant of the White House talking in such almost apocalyptic terms. So that's one thing. But then again, it's also a story of what didn't happen yesterday. And there was not a single member of the Republican Party who spoke out yesterday. There were a few written statements produced by people like Mitt Romney, the Republican senator who was probably Trump's biggest internal opponent in the party. But even he didn't bother to show up to commemorate the attack on their own Capitol. I mean, that's the thing that really, I think, for me, January 6th was this revelatory moment, not because I was surprised that Republicans would go along with Trump, but that they would do so even when their own workplace was attacked. Remember, this was the very first time since the War of 1812 that hostile forces occupied, if briefly, the United States Capitol, and literally derailed not just the work of Congress, but the fundamental constitutional work that Congress is required to do, which is to ratify the presidential election. There's no more important function, and that's what those protesters were there to do last year, not just to wave signs or wreak mayhem, but literally to stop the counting of the electoral votes. So where does that leave us? Someone said, and I really agree with this, that in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, it was seen as this sort of devastating, but, at least finale, the end of this catastrophic Trump presidency. And I think a year later, it's actually hard to see it as an ending so much as a beginning of the next stage of whatever this crisis in American politics is. So I think, the message internationally is to those who thought that we were getting over it and moving on, we're not. And that certainly ensures America will be very inwardly focused and, riven by irreconcilable divisions within, in a way that obviously, stands to benefit the Vladimir Putin's and Xi Jinping's of the world.
And we're joined by James Harding, Susan. That was great. James, wonderful to have you. I know you're somewhere in Kenya. So, truly world review and world news. I'll give you a moment to, I don't know how much you heard of what Susan said. I'll give you a moment to reflect, but it was the crisis is real. Let me turn to Stefan and, in some ways, and I think in Germany and the rest of the world, January 6th was seen as an exclamation point. And yet in some ways it's this new beginning that is darker. And I just wonder, a Germany that has just gone through a transition of power, a peaceful transition of power, with a new government coming in office, 5 weeks ago, or even less than that. And the picture of the incoming chancellor, being greeted by the outgoing chancellor and her getting in her car and driving away. That's what we remember of how democracy is supposed to be. So how does all of this look, the reality of a commemoration, as Susan said, of January 6th with only one party present, and Liz Cheney and her father on the other side, is really remarkable.
Well, it looks saddening, and it looks almost a bit frightening because we certainly follow things extremely closely, because this is so decisive on pretty much the course of all our world affairs right now. Whether this democracy can revive, whether this democracy, the American democracy, can regain power and strength and show us a way. I mean, it's a question of size, of presence, of institutional credibility, and in that respect, the presidency is of supreme importance to all of us. And if this presidency is belittled just by the fact that half of the political establishment is not showing up to commemorate such a moment, this is devastating. This is extremely saddening, and we all wonder whether, and that's sort of the tone you hear in all the writing here in Europe and Germany right now, whether the American democracy has suffered a hit, which is, well, not lethal, but at least it hasn't recovered from it yet. And we wonder where this will continue to. And so, yes, the memory of January 6th is a frightening one. Nevertheless, we've seen anti-democratic forces hitting all our streets, also in Europe now, with the pandemic not letting loose and driving opponents out there in drones and sort of delegitimizing government and governmental decisions and battling it. So the entire process of how democracies should work and how decisions are being accepted, are being made in parliament, sort of the normal give and take of democracy is in question. And if the United States cannot recover from that dysfunction, it will spread further in the democratic world. And that's no good news for all of us.
James, jump in here, reflect on not just only on January 6th, but sort of the state. Where does this take us? What's happening to democracy, sort of writ large? The example, of course, of Trump is being copied by Bolsonaro now in Brazil, and you see it in other places. There seems to be a certain fragility in the democratic system that is reflected in the U.S., but more generally, how do you look at see it?
So I think that, and apologies for being late, but sometimes the forces of 2021 continue into 2022, and your fight with Wi-Fi is one of them. I think that what Susan said at the end there about the emboldening of autocrats is right, and the retreat of democracy globally is depressingly true. But I think it's there for a further reason, and January 6th is a very important factor in this, which is America consumed by itself and the absence of America in the world. And what strikes me there is that it's not so much about the fragility of democracy, it's America's fear of the frailty of democracy. And, you know, I was in a conversation yesterday with Ray Dalio, most successful hedge fund manager, who's now, if you like, making it his business to talk about the likelihood of civil war if the two parties in the United States don't agree on the outcome of the election in 2024. I read Jimmy Carter's op-ed in the New York Times warning of civil conflict. David Remnick in the New Yorker is writing something similar. It's unthinkable when I was growing up, when I became a reporter out in China in the 90s, to have a former president, the editor of the New Yorker, and possibly one of the most successful figures in American capitalism, all to be in a state of such profound anguish about the fate, not of global democracy, but American democracy. And I think in that context, what you see are two things. One is America consumed by itself, and so failing to lead on so many things that matter, and we may come on to this later, whether it is COVAX and global vaccine inequality, or it is the creep of corruption in countries that otherwise would have sought to emulate or at least curry favor with the United States. So it's the US absence on one hand, and then it's also the copycat of American style politics in countries around the world. And you said this is a kind of big year for democracy in the United States, midterms, etc. But France, Brazil, Kenya, Philippines, those countries where democracy itself is also going to be tested, it's going to find no doubt at all it's copying some of the playbook of Trump and Biden.
And I guess, Susan, that sort of this, you know, when Biden likes to talk about not just the example of our power, but the power of our example. And in this case, the example that is being put forward is not the city on the hill that Ronald Reagan used to talk about. But an example of a dysfunctional political system that is no longer able to do basic things like providing tests for COVID 2 years into a pandemic, and I think, as James rightly says, consumed with itself, and more likely to be even more consumed with itself in 2022, and sort of the impact on global politics and the impact on what it means for the relationship with China, the relationship with Russia, the relationship with Europe. Let's stand Africa, Latin America, and other places. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I have a few quick observations, and I agree. You know, obviously with everything that's been said so far, a few observations. Number one, this is a midterm election year in which the Democratic Party, even without some of these sort of existential questions looming over it, would be disfavored no matter what. Just, you know, history suggests that a new president's party almost always suffers in the midterm elections. There are some structural reasons in American politics having to do with the drawing of district lines that favor Republicans disproportionate even to their support in the population. You know, then you look at Joe Biden's approval rating, which historically has had a connection, and now we have an increasingly nationalized politics. So that may be even more relevant now than it was, say, a decade or two ago. And Biden's approval ratings basically started to tank about 6 months ago in the middle of the summer. And have never recovered. And basically he ended his first year in office with the lowest approval ratings of any American president since they've been tracking them, except for Donald Trump. And he's really been in actually Trump basement type territory. So those three factors suggest the continuation of and even the worsening of our inward focus and looking at that. And as far as the geopolitics goes, you know, just quickly, I think what you're also seeing is a real, almost a decoupling actually between the Biden administration's foreign policy and its political situation and our sort of domestic political concerns. So you've seen really very little focus on foreign policy aside from the kind of brief spurt of attention paid to Afghanistan and the sort of tragic, messy pullout from Afghanistan over the summer. And, while broadly speaking as a policy matter that has, I don't think there's any Americans, right or left, who are clamoring to re-invade Afghanistan or any other country for that matter right now. It has been successfully used, and I believe will be successfully used as an example of Biden's general sort of weakness, which is part of the indictment that Republicans frankly were mustering against him before he even came into office. So even though Donald Trump would have done the exact same thing and probably worse, it's still a key part of their bill of particulars against Biden. And I think that goes generally to foreign policy. You see that rhetoric right now when it comes to what to do about Russia and Ukraine. I know we'll talk about that, but Biden's weak, Biden's weak, Biden's weak, and it almost doesn't matter what he does. But there will be a critique from Republicans this year that will increasingly factor into how Americans think about the rest of the world. This idea of American weakness, even though everyone in this conversation knows that it's been a long-term trajectory that has gotten us to a place where, the U.S. just wasn't in a position to maintain this kind of sole superpower status any longer. And then just a final quick observation before we move on. I remember very vividly having a conversation and being on this discussion with you, Ivo, and Stefan in the immediate aftermath of the January 6th last year, probably within a few weeks. And something Stefan said at that time really stuck with me and is a metric we might be able to judge where we are by. And he said, I just hope from the rest of the world, that cares about the United States, there has to be accountability. There has to be accountability. And this is something I just remember so vividly. There has to be the rule of law. These people have to be arrested. And I would say that by that standard that you correctly set out for us a year ago, you could look at success and also enormous failure. There have been, according to the Attorney General, who gave a speech the other day, more than 700 arrests. And there was this incredible national manhunt here in the United States to round up the people who stormed into the Capitol and to show that even if they weren't arrested on that day, that they could not invade our Capitol without accountability. And I think people saw that, and it's impressive. And yet it also shows the tragic limits of our system. A year later, not a single person, not one person has been arrested and charged with inciting the people and driving those people to be there at the Capitol on that day. And while Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, suggested in a vague sort of sense, well, we are, willing to look at not just the foot soldiers and we'll, drive on towards accountability, it defies credibility to think that Joe Biden's Justice Department is going to arrest Donald Trump and charge him with the crime of inciting this attack on our democracy, even though I think there is certainly a view that he is both narrowly and broadly responsible for that. And it's just like the 2008 financial crisis, really. The little people are arrested, and certainly those who engaged in criminal acts, should be held accountable. And yet, the fat cats go free.
Stefan, comment on this, and I also I would love to hear. Germany is kind of in a unique position right now. It has a new government. It did change after 16 years of rule by Merkel. It is facing a Europe that is either facing elections in France or weakness, and so there is an opportunity here for Germany to lead in the vacuum. And so I'd love to get your sense of whether that's possible, but also, of course, give you an opportunity to comment more widely. And
well, let me add two thoughts. One on your point of whether Germany will lead. Germany has the G7 in that half year, so there could be an opportunity to lead, to set an example. Otherwise, I'm not too optimistic about the foreign policy outreach of this new government. They're deeply sort of obsessed with their domestic and sort of internal problems right now. You also already see the first cracks in this sort of coalition harmony. So I wouldn't expect too much of them. But what strikes me most is in this entire debate, and I know we can spend the rest of the show to talk about it, is the absence of normalcy. It's the absence of the middle ground. It's always either extremely bad or extremely good. Joe Biden is either entirely a loser or the big winner. There's no middle ground. And I'm wondering whether this might have a little bit to do with sort of the communication normalcy we do face right now. David Remnick in your paper, Susan, wrote about the exercise of fear mongering. And that might actually be a very good phrase to warn ourselves not to get things out of perspective all the time. We have to go back to some normalcy. We have to get sort of the good things reported. And I totally agree, Susan, about the lack of accountability, which still is a huge problem. But not every action in a democracy is either hyperbolic super or super bad. There is a middle ground, and we have to get used to this kind of normalcy again if we won't burn in the heat of the extremists all the time.
Excellent point.
Here, here.
And the press and the media has a role to play in that. I would argue. James?
2 points, as much as anything, I suppose, Ivo, to ourselves. One is that we talk about this, and we've talked about it now for 5 years, whether it's been Brexit in the UK or Trump in the US, about a change in the terms of trade of politics. And we're now feeling the consequences everywhere, and we're feeling it in the way in which domestic politics is conducted, but global politics too. You know, it's hard to think of a global organization, whether it's the UN or NATO or others, where you think at WHO, you think, right, we have confidence in how these people are executing the mandate they've got. And we point to world leaders, but particularly to the US. And so I think the first point to ourselves is whether or not it's the Chicago Council or it's news organizations that try to not just think through the world that they see, but think constructively about what might come next. You do have to say we've all been operating on the hope that we might go back to where we were, and we all know it's not going to happen. So whether 2022 is a challenge to ourselves in that sense, in terms of how do you rewrite the rules of global cooperation, how do you seek to export some of those principles of democracy that seemed like it was going so well in the kind of 90s and noughties, is one point. And I'd pray in aid my second point, which is, if you look at, and my lens of reading what's happening in the US is largely the US media, I look at what's running front page, I look at what's leading those bulletins. If you take 3 or 4 stories from the last week, Kazakhstan and what looks like the return or the reassertion of some kind of Russian footprint on the stars, South Africa, the Guptas, and essentially state capture, the corruption of Africa's most promising economy. If you look at just Omicron numbers around the world, right, and vaccination rates, if you look at any of these things, what's amazing is it's not making a dent, at least as far as I can see, on the US political consciousness at the moment. And I don't know how you change that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very apt observation. It is and by the way, I think it reinforces your first point in your first intervention about the inwardness and the insularity, and to Stefan's point, the polarized nature of the debate that is affecting the US. And therefore its impact in the world, right?
And by the way, I should just say, it's not an American thing. We're the same. COVID has made us, the combination of COVID and Boris Johnson has made us more self-involved than we've ever been.
Yes, I'm still looking for global Britain, aren't we? James and Susan earlier opened up the door, Stefan, to to our second big subject, really here of, what one might call the Russia problem or the Russia issue. 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. We have the start of some diplomatic engagement next week. But then this quite surprising, I think, for all of us, explosion in Kazakhstan over the past few days, pulling in Russia in very much in a similar way that it was pulled in other parts of its periphery. Tell us, first of all, sort of what's happening, and secondly, how should we think about this? Stefan?
I mean, what we saw is this quite surprising uprising in Kazakhstan from sort of ordinary people who were reacting to the fuel price increase, which is astounding in such a country where energy fuel is in abundance. But probably the two more decisive stories now unfolding are the battle between the old ruler, who still had his hands on the grip on the country, Nazarbayev, who seems to be now to be pushed out by his chosen successor, Tokayev, who's now marking with pretty harsh rhetoric his position and trying to really suppress that kind of upheaval in the streets. And you don't know whether that what we see in the streets is sort of the effect of that, rather of that immediate power battle between the two strongmen, or whether it caused that power battle between the strongmen. We will see over the next days. The next unfolding story is that, surprisingly, Tokayev asked for military help from Russia. There's a military alliance led by Moscow, which hasn't been active for the last 20 years since it is actually in place. It's the first time that they were called on. It's the first time that Russia uses the opportunity to put a foot in these stance, and where we do see either the return of Moscow rule in these countries, or actually the beginning of the demise of Russia, because this is the least thing the people there in those countries want. They enjoy their newfound independence. They develop some kind of nationalistic pride, and they don't want to be governed by Moscow anymore. So Putin is playing a dangerous game here, because he's not knowing where this will end, and he stretches his ability, since he's occupied in Ukraine as well. Strangely enough, one of their battalions, which was positioned at the Ukrainian border, used to be in charge of the Kazakhstan area, or at least that southern rim of Russia. So we see a multi-level game which is unfolding here. For me, the sort of on the next level, the most surprising, or most sort of even pleasing news in this is that there seems to be a public conscience of good and bad in these countries. And these kind of authoritarian regimes do have a limited lifetime, because at a certain point, anger boils over and things are getting out of control. And that might be a message for all those who hang in this eternal battle we do see now between the West and on the global scene with Russia and China. Last word, tomorrow we'll see the start of diplomatic talks between the US and Russia. Reassuring for me was that the American side made all efforts to involve the Europeans. The Europeans put their foot in the door. The German and French foreign policy advisors to their respective chancellors and presidents were in Moscow yesterday, negotiating, or at least sort of pretending to talk to Russia. So there is a process starting. The question is, can we sort of channel this whole pressure which there is into some kind of useful talks with probably even some positive outcome, like arms control talks or things like that.
James, I think Stefan really lays it all out, and if this is a multi-dimensional chess game that's going on, autocracy versus democracy, Russia's insecurities, and then sort of the wider European security framework and the U.S. role in it. What do you think? What do you see driving the story over the next few weeks and of this thing? Is it's the protest? Is Putin's sense of his own weakness and vulnerability, or some combination of it all?
So I'm actually rather reassured listening to what Stefan says, and don't know whether or not to be optimistic enough to believe it, in the sense that I should say Stefan is much more kind of profoundly acquainted with this. This is not my area, the stance. This is a really complicated place, difficult to understand. I suppose what I find myself questioning, and Stefan, I'd be really to know what you think on this, is whether or not what we're seeing, when you add it up, Georgia, Ukraine, now Kazakhstan, Belarus in 2021, is that actually, in a ragged way, Putin's reassertion of Russian hemispheric influence either is happening or has happened. And the fact that in Kazakhstan, the Russians, 2,500 soldiers and military personnel invited into the country, suggests that that's already happening. And I wonder whether or not we look at this, and we always think, given the fragility of the Russian economy and the relative thinness of the Russian military, that Putin's overreached. But maybe we've just read that wrong. Maybe actually the period of independence for those former Soviet Union states was just that, the period of independence. And there's the reassertion of Russian hemispheric influence at the very least.
Susan, how do you see a sort of, I think James is making a case for this is the strength of Russia, the reassertion of strength of Russia. Others see it as Putin's fear that this will come home, that the protest will that he's trying to prevent something really bad happening in Russia itself. You've studied Vladimir Putin more than anyone. What do you think he's thinking right now, and how does he think he gets out of the box he's in a positive way, negative way? How do you look at it?
Well, I definitely think that regime survival has been sort of at the core of Putin's animating principles, both internally in Russia and in terms of his foreign policy for his entire 2-decade tenure, and that has been much more of a motivator often than than is assessed in the West, and that drove in some ways his views on Ukraine and a series of kind of conflicts between pro-Western, as he saw it, dangerous revolutionaries and those who would pull or were purchased in order to pull Ukraine back into Russia's sphere. Part of it is foreign policy, but a lot of it, when it comes to Kazakhstan or Ukraine or Belarus, is about making sure that the Russian people don't see a powerful alternate model that they would themselves want to apply inside Russia itself. And that was part of even the motivating factor for Putin to go into Syria. Part of it was opportunistic, the opportunity to tweak the United States and others. Part of it was the longstanding Russian military alliance with Assad and their base there, which was, basically the last significant Russian position in the Middle East. But then a lot of it was also the principle, which does matter to Putin, essentially, that we don't want the people thinking that they can rise up and have people power to topple corrupt leaders, especially those who are seen as beholden in some way to Moscow. And so I think that's a very important, even a foundational principle for Putin's Russia. And remember that over the last year, he has engaged in a very significant domestic crackdown, the arrest of Alexei Navalny, the shutting down of Memorial, the leading Russian human rights organization, the very same week, and this was not an accident, the very same week as the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Putin has viewed for a long time as he put it publicly, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And so I think these are all related crises when it comes to Putin, also not one-off, like here's Kazakhstan and here's Ukraine and here's Belarus. Remember that Belarus has also had, this, on the one hand, inspiring message. I appreciate Stefan's effort at, showing the optimistic view, which is real, which is that even despite these decades of repression and corruption in these countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan, that the spirit exists within people. It's always infuriated and depressed me, the extent to which people would say things like, well, the Russian people, don't have a history of democracy. And, it's this incredibly kind of patronizing and I think wrong-headed view. And so you can look at the incredible spirit and resilience of people. They're still protesting the stolen election in Belarus, despite everything. So you can look at that, but you can also look at, the tools available to Putin and his, tin pot dictators in the region. And unfortunately, they've acquired capacity in the last couple of decades rather than lost capacity, it seems to me, to put down the spirit of these people. And so, I think it's a very tough time in part, and I'll let it go here. Sure, it's good to have these negotiations and conversations with the Biden people, which are going to take place in Geneva with Europeans and NATO. But the truth is, if Vladimir Putin wants to invade Ukraine, there will be a high cost exacted, but he can do it. And that is even more the case in Kazakhstan. He's just gone ahead and put in a significant, possibly even determinative Russian military presence there. And a week ago, we didn't even know that could happen. So it's a bad time for anybody who cares about human rights and individual dignity in Eastern Europe.
Just to add, the Spetsnaz forces that are being sent into Kazakhstan, of course, are the same forces that went into Chechnya, that went into Ukraine, that went into Syria, that went into Georgia in 2008. It does have this sense of a leading effort to really fundamentally change the internal balance, Stefan. And then there's the other issue of protecting Russians, which he has seen and announced as a sort of new Putin doctrine, like the Brezhnev doctrine. Wherever Russians live, Moscow will protect you. And of course, in Kazakhstan, the Russian population is a larger percentage than in Ukraine as part of it.
Courtesy of Stalin.
Exactly. Yeah. So, Stefan, is this the leading edge of the reassertion of Russian influence in the periphery? And if so,
I wouldn't judge it right now. It's far too early. It could go both ways. And quite honestly, I'm assured by the fact that there seems to be a deep conscience for justice in those countries still alive by the population. If you look at the videos coming out of Kazakhstan, all those people claiming they were shot at unwillingly, just without any kind of plan from the forces. I mean, this is there is something going wrong, and people know it, and they know it in Belarus, and they know it in Ukraine, they know it elsewhere, they know it in Russia. I mean, the Russian state cannot prevent this population from an infection, from a disease, which is taking the biggest toll of all countries in the world in that country, in Russia. So, I mean, we really should not underestimate. What we do know is we cannot change it from the outside. Things will change from internally. So people in Kazakhstan will decide on the fate whether this works or not. And Putin can't be there forever. And so we are either now watching the beginning of his end game or the beginning of his revisionist vision, which he always held and which he wants to push through in negotiations with us now, with the West. But even if he could invade Ukraine, I'm damn sure he cannot hold it. This is a far too big country and a far too proud and far too self-assured country in the meantime, as that they would submit themselves to some Russian will right now.
James, last word to you.
It's a very quick question, really, back to you in the light of this, to you, Ivo, and to Susan, which is there seems to be this rather baked-in narrative now that, if you like, Biden has 10 months to get his domestic agenda through before the midterms. Is that the view in national security circles too, that actually there's 10 months to get some momentum on the foreign policy front, or there'll be a clear out at the top of state, defense, NSC?
Well, no, the time is already up. The view is that the 10 months were last year. and that time is already up when it comes certainly to his domestic agenda. The one positive, this has been a long time, kind of way of thinking in Washington, but I think it still holds, is that the less talk there is about foreign policy, the better it is for foreign policy. And so the best thing you can say about foreign policy is, to the extent it's sort of fallen off the radar, that gives them a wider hand to actually do things. So no, the time's already up.
Sorry, Eva.
Yeah, no, on the domestic side, I think that's right. But when domestic politics become problematical, what do White Houses do? They start thinking about foreign policy. And there is a natural inclination, of course, for Joe Biden, which is where his heart is. Yes, it's also on the domestic side, but he's also always been a foreign policy animal. And I think in the next 2-3 years, starting this year, foreign policy will become more prominent. What it means for the team, I think, is too early to tell. We're just a couple of minutes left, and I just want to go around the room, and I'll start with you, James. So what's the big story you're watching in 2022, and particularly what might we be missing if we don't look carefully?
So I think that the things that we're probably going to spend a lot of time talking about in this hour are not going to happen. Taiwan, Iran, possibly even North Korea. I don't think they'll happen in 2022 in terms of happen in the most catastrophic and worrying sense. I think that corruption as a real destabilizer in places as far-flung as I mentioned, South Africa and the Guptas, but it's really interesting how it's playing out in Portugal. It's really interesting how it's playing out in the assessment of government and politics. Brazil is obviously another place, but it's true in the UK too. I think corruption is one of those things that kind of creeps along, but eventually catches up with you. But I think the proximate cause of the biggest foreign policy stories of 2022 will be inflation, both in terms of cost of living, as we've seen in Kazakhstan, and I suspect, given countries that have US dollar denominated debt, a number of financial crises that will then result in something, much more public and on the streets.
We'll be watching it here. Susan, what are you looking at as the big story you think in 2022 that we ought to be paying attention to?
Well, my version may or may not happen or become sort of acute in 2022, but I definitely think that we have not paid enough attention to the real new theaters of national security rivalry and sort of danger points between China and the United States, both in terms of a new nuclear arms race, hypersonic race, and the race in space. Probably the most jarring experience I had, and obviously I wasn't able to sort of travel and report all that much in 2021, but one of the things I did do was go on a reporting trip around the US last spring with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I went to the new headquarters of the US Space Force in Colorado. And I have to say, the Space Command, I should say, not the Space Force, which are actually different things, which is confusing. And the most terrifying thing, honestly, was my feeling that it was like being in the ground floor of the Cold War decades ago, in the sense that there was this inevitability, like we're getting ready for this terrible, devastating conflict. And of course, that creates this kind of tragically inevitable cycle where the conflict is then going to occur. And so I would really spotlight that. And then I asked my son, who is much more technologically fluent than I am, and he said one thing that I think is really brilliant. He also mentioned the arms race with China, but he said the next nuclear arms race is going to be any country that possesses super intelligent AGI, meaning artificial general intelligence, will have incredible capability. And this is just another version of it, but this is something that the US is behind in, and it's not at all discussed by policymakers in a broad sense in the foreign policy conversation.
Getting more and more scared the longer we talk. Stefan, good news. You only have 30 seconds. So
well,
what are you looking at?
I just have one sentence. Don't look up is not the advice we should follow.
That's a wonderful way to end. Don't look up. We're just looking. We'll just
Do
go.
look up. Do look up.
Do look
Things
up.
to
Do
discover.
look far. Do look up. Make sure that you find what's going on. We won't do commercials for anything, but we will do a commercial for World Review. We'll be back next week and every other week. Every Friday. Wonderful to have Stefan Kornelius, Susan Glasser, James Harding joining us this week. A lot of things to talk about for sure. Hopefully there's some positive ones coming out too. In the meantime, thank you all for watching, and we'll be back next week with another version of World Review. Thank you all.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Bye-bye.